The elevator hummed its familiar tune as it climbed toward the 42nd floor of the Morrison Financial Tower, carrying within it a man whose world was about to shift in ways he never could have imagined. Marcus Chen adjusted his Armani tie. For the third time that morning, a nervous habit he'd developed over the past 6 months since his divorce was finalized. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The reflection staring back at him from the polished steel doors showed a successful man by any measure. Sharp jawline, meticulously styled black hair, and eyes that had closed billion-dollar deals without flinching. Yet behind those confident brown eyes lay a hollowness that no amount of money could fill. At 34, Marcus had built Chen Industries. From a small import business his grandfather started into one of the most influential tech consulting firms on the West Coast. His corner office overlooked the bustling streets of downtown San Francisco, where morning fog rolled in like clockwork, painting the city in shades of gray that somehow matched his mood these days. Success had come at a price he was only beginning to understand, and that price had a name: loneliness. The elevator dinged softly as it reached his floor, and Marcus stepped out into the marble-lined hallway that led to his private suite. His assistant Patricia, a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and a motherly disposition that somehow survived in the corporate world, looked up from her computer with the kind of smile that suggested she knew something he didn't. "Good morning, Mr. Chen," she said, her voice carrying that familiar warmth that had become one of the few genuine human connections in his sterile professional world. "Your 9 o'clock with the Henderson Group has been moved to 10:30. Apparently, their CFO got stuck in traffic coming from Oakland." Marcus nodded, grateful for the delay, though he wouldn't admit it. These days, even successful meetings felt hollow, like going through the motions of a life that belonged to someone else. He walked past Patricia's desk toward his office, but her voice stopped him mid-stride. "Oh, and Marcus." She rarely used his first name during business hours, which made him turn around with curiosity. "There's been some kind of mix-up with the building management. They've had to relocate some of the daycare services to the floor below us temporarily. I hope the noise won't be too distracting during your calls." Marcus barely registered Patricia's words about the daycare situation as he settled into his leather chair and powered up his computer. The morning ritual of checking emails, reviewing quarterly reports, and analyzing market trends had become as automatic as breathing. His office, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist decor, felt more like a museum than a workspace. Everything was perfectly arranged, from the awards lining his bookshelf to the single family photo he kept turned face down on his desk, a reminder of what he'd lost when his marriage to Victoria collapsed under the weight of his obsession with work. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent years building an empire only to discover he had no one to share it with. Victoria had left him 8 months ago, taking with her the dreams of children they'd once planned, the warmth of Sunday morning, conversations, and the possibility of a future that meant more than profit margins and stock options. The divorce had been finalized with the same cold efficiency that characterized most of his business dealings, leaving him with everything he thought he wanted and nothing he actually needed. As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself distracted by sounds filtering up from the floor below. The building's ventilation system had always carried noise between floors, but he'd never noticed it before because the 41st floor typically housed accounting firms and legal offices, quiet, professional spaces that operated at the same subdued volume as his own world. Today, however, there were different sounds: children's laughter, the soft murmur of caregivers' voices, and occasionally the cry of a baby that seemed to pierce through the corporate barrier he'd built around his heart. He tried to focus on the Henderson Group presentation, a multi-million-dollar consulting contract that would normally command his complete attention. But every few minutes, his concentration was broken by the unfamiliar symphony of childhood. Playing out one floor below, there was something both foreign and deeply familiar about those sounds, as if they awakened memories he'd carefully buried beneath years of professional achievement. Around 11:30, as Marcus was reviewing financial projections for the third time without retaining any of the information, he heard something that made him stop completely. It was a young woman's voice, gentle but tired, speaking in the kind of patient tone that suggested she'd repeated the same words countless times. "Come on, sweetheart. Say daddy. Can you say daddy for mommy?" The voice was soft, almost musical, but there was an undertone of sadness that Marcus recognized because he'd been carrying the same weight himself. It was the sound of someone trying to hold on to hope when everything seemed to be falling apart. He found himself setting down his pen and listening more intently, though he couldn't explain why a stranger's voice had captured his attention so completely. "Da-da," came a tiny response, followed by what sounded like clapping hands and the woman's delighted laughter. "That's right, baby. Daddy. Even though he's not here with us, we remember how to say his name, don't we?" Marcus felt something twist in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since the early days of his divorce, when the reality of his losses first began to sink in. There was something heartbreaking about the exchange, the way the young woman was teaching her child to remember someone who was absent. It reminded him of his own childhood, when his father worked 18-hour days, building the business that Marcus had inherited, leaving behind a legacy of success and a void where paternal presence should have been. Unable to concentrate on work, Marcus found himself walking to the window that faced the building's interior courtyard. From his vantage point, he could see down into the temporary daycare area that had been set up on the 41st floor. The space was filled with colorful mats, toy boxes, and small groups of children engaged in various activities under the watchful eyes of several caregivers. But his attention was immediately drawn to a corner near the window where a young woman sat cross-legged on the floor, holding a baby who couldn't have been more than 18 months old. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with long chestnut hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing clothes that were clean but clearly inexpensive. A faded blue sweater and jeans that had seen better days. Despite her modest appearance, there was something luminous about her as she played with the child, a kind of natural grace that money couldn't buy and corporate training couldn't teach. She was completely absorbed in her interaction with the baby, oblivious to the world around her, as she continued the language lesson that had first caught Marcus's attention. "Daddy loves you," she was saying, helping the baby clap its small hands together. "Even when we can't see him, Daddy loves you so much. Can you say love, 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 love?" The baby gurgled happily, reaching up to touch the woman's face with tiny fingers, and Marcus watched as she closed her eyes for a moment, as if drawing strength from that simple gesture of affection. When she opened them again, he could see, even from his distance, that there were tears threatening to spill over, though she maintained her bright smile for the child's benefit. Marcus found himself wondering about their story. Where was the father? Was he deployed overseas, working multiple jobs to support his family, or had he abandoned them altogether? The woman's careful instruction suggested someone who was trying to keep a memory alive, to ensure that this child would know something about a father who wasn't present. It spoke to a kind of devotion that Marcus had rarely encountered in his business-focused world, where relationships were often transactional and commitment was measured in quarterly returns. As he watched, another caregiver approached the young woman, an older Hispanic woman with graying hair who moved with the confident efficiency of someone who'd spent years working with children. Marcus couldn't hear their conversation from his position, but he could see the younger woman's shoulders sag slightly as they spoke. The older woman placed a comforting hand on her arm, and Marcus caught fragments of their exchange through the building's ventilation system. "No, this is hard, Misha, but you're doing the right thing. Just want him to remember somehow, you know. I don't want him to grow up thinking, his daddy was a good man, and this baby will know that because of you." The conversation was too fragmented for Marcus to piece together the complete story, but the emotion was unmistakable. This was a young mother struggling with loss, trying to build something positive from what appeared to be a devastating situation. It reminded him of his own mother, who had worked tirelessly to maintain family connections even when his father's business demands threatened to tear them apart. Marcus realized he'd been standing at the window for nearly 20 minutes, completely abandoning his work to observe strangers whose lives had somehow become more compelling than his own carefully structured existence. This wasn't like him. Marcus Chen was known for his laser focus, his ability to compartmentalize, his talent for keeping personal feelings separate from professional responsibilities. Yet here he was, captivated by a scene that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the kinds of human connections he'd been missing. The Henderson Group meeting was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, and Marcus hadn't finished reviewing the presentation materials. This was a crucial contract, one that could position Chen Industries as the leading consulting firm for emerging technologies on the entire West Coast. By all rights, he should have been rehearsing his pitch, double-checking financial projections, and preparing for the kinds of challenging questions that high-stakes clients always asked. Instead, he found himself reaching for his phone and dialing Patricia's extension. "Patricia, I need you to find out more about the daycare situation downstairs. Who's running it? How long they'll be there? That sort of thing." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Marcus could practically hear Patricia's surprise. In the 5 years she'd worked as his assistant, he'd never shown interest in building operations that didn't directly affect his business. "Of course, Mr. Chen. May I ask if there's a specific issue, noise, concerns for your meetings?" "No, nothing like that. I'm just curious." It was a weak explanation, and they both knew it, but Patricia was too professional to press for details. "I'll make some calls and get back to you." Marcus hung up and returned to the window, but the young woman and her baby had moved to a different area of the daycare where he couldn't see them clearly. The loss of visual contact left him feeling strangely bereft, as if he'd been watching a movie that had suddenly cut to black at a crucial moment. He tried to refocus on his work, pulling up the Henderson Group files and forcing himself to read through the technical specifications and budget projections that would normally hold his complete attention. But concentration proved impossible. Every few minutes, he found himself listening for that gentle voice drifting up from below, hoping to catch another fragment of the conversation between mother and child. The sounds of the temporary daycare had become a soundtrack to his morning, replacing the usual sterile silence of his corporate environment with something that felt unexpectedly alive. When Patricia called back 15 minutes later, her information was surprisingly detailed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The daycare, she explained, was called Little Miracles Child Development Center, and they'd been forced to relocate temporarily due to flooding in their regular facility across town. The center served primarily low-income families, offering subsidized childcare for single parents, students, and families struggling to make ends meet. They would be using the 41st floor for approximately 2 weeks while repairs were completed at their permanent location. The director is a woman named Rosa Martinez, Patricia continued. She's been running the center for 12 years, and according to building management, they've never had any complaints about noise or disruption. Apparently, they're very well regarded in the community. Marcus absorbed this information, though he wasn't sure why he'd requested it. What did it matter to him that a temporary daycare was operating one floor below? His life would continue, exactly as it had before, filled with meetings and presentations and the endless pursuit of professional success that had defined his existence for the past decade. Yet as he prepared for the Henderson Group meeting, Marcus found himself thinking about the young woman's patient voice teaching her baby to say, "Daddy." There was something profound about that simple act. The determination to keep love alive even in the face of loss, the commitment to building connection across absence, the faith that words could carry meaning even when the person they represented wasn't there to hear them. The Henderson Group executives arrived precisely on time, 3 men in identical dark suits carrying leather portfolios and the kind of serious expressions that suggested they took themselves very seriously. Marcus greeted them in the conference room, adjacent to his office, a space designed to impress with its panoramic city views and state-of-the-art presentation technology. These were the moments when his carefully cultivated professional persona typically took over, when Marcus Chen, the successful CEO, replaced Marcus Chen, the increasingly lonely human being. But as he began his presentation, outlining Chen Industries' capabilities and track record, Marcus found his attention divided. The daycare sounds were fainter in the conference room, but still audible, and he caught himself pausing mid-sentence when he heard that familiar voice from below. "Let's sing the Daddy song, okay? Daddy loves me, yes he does, even when he's far away." The Henderson Group CFO, a stern-faced man named Williams, noticed Marcus's momentary distraction. "Is there a problem, Mr. Chen?" Marcus forced himself to focus, delivering the remainder of his presentation with the polished professionalism that had built his reputation. The meeting concluded successfully, with the Henderson Group expressing strong interest in moving forward with the partnership. But even as Marcus shook hands and exchanged business cards, part of his mind remained tuned to the gentle rhythms of life playing out one floor below. After the clients left, Marcus stood alone in his office, staring out at the San Francisco skyline without really seeing it. The fog had burned off, revealing a brilliant blue sky that seemed to mock the grey mood that had settled over him like a familiar weight. He thought about Victoria, about the children they'd planned to have someday, when the business was more stable, when there was more time, when life somehow became less demanding. Someday had never arrived, and now it never would. The irony was bitter. He'd spent years building something that was supposed to provide security for a family, only to discover that the building process had cost him the very thing he'd been trying to protect. Victoria had tried to explain it during their final argument, her voice breaking as she told him that she felt like she was married to a company rather than a man. He'd dismissed her concerns then, confident that success would solve whatever problems they faced. Now, alone in his impressive office, he understood that success without connection was just another form of emptiness. The phone rang, interrupting his brooding thoughts. Patricia's voice came through the intercom with her usual efficiency, but there was something different in her tone, a warmth that suggested she was about to share something she thought would interest him. "Mr. Chen, I have Rosa Martinez from the daycare center on line 2. She wanted to speak with you personally to thank you for your patience with the temporary relocation." Marcus hesitated for a moment. He hadn't expected direct contact with the daycare director, and he wasn't sure what he would say. But curiosity won out over caution, and he picked up the phone. "This is Marcus Chen." "Mr. Chen, this is Rosa Martinez from Little Miracles Child Development Center. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Rosa's voice was warm and maternal, with a slight accent that suggested English was her second language. There was An immediate quality of genuineness that Marcus rarely encountered in his business dealings, a sense that this was someone who said exactly what she meant without calculation or agenda. "Not at all, Ms. Martinez. I understand you'll be using our floor temporarily. I hope the space is working out for your needs." "Oh yes, it's wonderful. The children love being up so high. They can see the whole city from those windows. I actually called because I wanted to make sure we weren't causing any disruption for your business. I know corporate environments need to be quiet, and we have some very enthusiastic little ones here." Marcus found himself smiling for the first time that day. "Actually, it's been pleasant. Different, but pleasant. I'm so glad to hear that. You know, it's funny, one of our parents was just telling me that she heard someone walking around upstairs during story time, and she wondered if maybe you had children of your own. She said it sounded like someone who was listening." The comment caught Marcus off guard. He hadn't realized his movements might be audible to the daycare below, hadn't considered that his curiosity might be as apparent to them as their presence was to him. The idea that a stranger had somehow sensed his attention, his interest in their world, felt both embarrassing and oddly touching. "I don't have children," Marcus said, the words coming out more quietly than he'd intended. "Oh." There was a pause, and Marcus could hear Rosa processing this information with the kind of sensitivity that suggested she understood there might be more to the story. "Well, if you ever want to visit, you're certainly welcome. We're always happy to show people what we do here. The children love meeting new friends." After hanging up, Marcus sat in his chair, feeling as if something had shifted, though he couldn't quite identify what. The invitation to visit the daycare was probably just politeness, the kind of thing people said without really meaning it. But Rosa's voice had carried genuine warmth, and the idea of actually meeting the young woman whose patient voice had captured his attention seemed both terrifying and irresistible. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of routine business. Conference, calls with clients, review sessions with his project managers, the endless stream of emails that seemed to multiply faster than he could respond to them. But underneath the familiar rhythm of corporate life, Marcus found himself counting the hours until the daycare would close, wondering if he would hear that gentle voice again before the day ended. At 4:30, as he was finishing a call with a client in Seattle, Marcus heard the unmistakable sounds of children being prepared for pickup. There were voices calling out names, the rustle of small coats being put on, and the general bustle that accompanied the end of a school day. He moved to his window, hoping to catch another glimpse of the young woman and her baby, but the angle was wrong, and he could only see part of the daycare area. That's when he made a decision that would have seemed impossible to him just a few hours earlier. Marcus Chen, CEO of a multi-million-dollar consulting firm, found himself walking out of his office and heading for the elevator. Patricia looked up in surprise as he passed her desk without explanation, but he was already committed to a course of action that he didn't fully understand himself. The 41st floor was bustling with activity as parents arrived to collect their children. Marcus stepped off the elevator, feeling completely out of place in his expensive suit among the casual clothes and tired faces of working parents at the end of a long day. The temporary daycare had been set up in what was normally a large conference room, and the transformation was remarkable. Where corporate furniture usually sat, there were now colorful play areas, reading corners, and art stations that made the space feel warm and alive. Rosa Martinez was easy to spot, a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, moving efficiently between parents while keeping one eye on the children who were still waiting for pickup. She looked up as Marcus approached, and her face brightened with genuine pleasure. "Mr. Chen, how wonderful that you decided to visit. Let me introduce you to some of our families." Before Marcus could explain that he wasn't sure why he'd come, Rosa was guiding him into the cheerful chaos of pickup time. Children ran between their parents' legs, calling out goodbyes to friends and caregivers. Mothers and fathers gathered artwork and lunchboxes while catching up on their children's daily adventures. It was a scene of everyday family life that felt both foreign and deeply appealing to someone who had spent years insulated from such simple human interactions. "This is Mr. Chen," Rosa announced to no one in particular. "He's the businessman upstairs who's been so kind about sharing his building with us." Several parents smiled and nodded, offering the kind of polite acknowledgement that strangers give each other in social situations. But Marcus was scanning the room for someone specific, looking for chestnut hair and a faded blue sweater, listening for the gentle voice that had captivated him hours earlier. He found her in a corner near the windows, sitting on a small chair while a toddler played with blocks at her feet. Up close, she was even more striking than she'd appeared from his office window. Her face had a natural beauty that needed no enhancement, with high cheekbones and expressive green eyes that suggested both intelligence and deep sadness. She looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying burdens too heavy for someone so young, but when she interacted with the baby, her entire expression transformed with love and tenderness. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, unsure how to approach or what he would say if he did. This wasn't a business meeting where he had prepared talking points and clear objectives. This was human interaction at its most basic level, something he'd forgotten how to navigate during his years of corporate success. The decision was made for him when the baby looked up and caught sight of Marcus standing nearby. The child's face broke into a wide grin, and he pointed in Marcus's direction with the kind of uninhibited enthusiasm that only very young children possess. "Well, hello there," Marcus heard himself saying, his voice softer than it had been all day. The young woman looked up, following her baby's gaze, and Marcus found himself staring directly into those remarkable green eyes. There was a moment of mutual surprise, as if both of them were startled by the sudden connection. She had been in the middle of packing a small diaper bag, and her hands stilled as she looked at him with curiosity and perhaps a touch of wariness. "Hi," she said simply, her voice carrying the same musical quality that had drawn his attention from the floor above. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" Marcus realized he was staring and forced himself to speak normally. "I'm Marcus Chen. I work upstairs and I just wanted to... I heard about the daycare being relocated, and I thought I'd stop by to see if everything was working out." It was a weak explanation, and they both knew it, but the young woman smiled politely. "That's very thoughtful of you. I'm Sarah Williams, and this is my son, Jamie. Sarah Williams." Finally, a name to go with the voice that had been haunting his thoughts all day. Marcus found himself kneeling down to Jamie's level, something he wouldn't normally do in an expensive suit, but the baby's infectious smile made such considerations seem irrelevant. "Hi, Jamie," Marcus said, and was rewarded with a burst of happy babbling that sounded like the most important conversation he'd had all week. "He's very social," Sarah explained, and Marcus caught something in her tone, a mixture of pride and sadness that suggested this sociability was both a blessing and a burden. "He loves meeting new people." "How old is he?" 15 months. He'll be walking soon, I think. He's already pulling himself up on everything." As if to demonstrate, Jamie reached for Marcus's tie, grabbing the silk fabric with surprising strength. Marcus found himself laughing, a sound that felt rusty from disuse, and he gently extracted his tie from the baby's grasp. "Strong grip," Marcus observed. "He's going to be a force to be reckoned with." "He already is," Sarah said, and for the first time her smile reached her eyes. "Sometimes I think he's the only thing keeping me sane." The comment slipped out before she could stop it, and Marcus saw her face flush with embarrassment as she realized she'd shared something more personal than intended. There was something vulnerable about the admission, a crack in the composed facade she'd been maintaining that gave Marcus a glimpse of the struggles beneath. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to. It's just been a long day." "Don't apologize," Marcus said, his voice gentler than he'd heard it in months. "I think I understand something about long days." They looked at each other for a moment, two strangers who had somehow stumbled into an unexpectedly honest exchange. Marcus realized that this was the most genuine conversation he'd had in weeks, possibly months. In his corporate world, every interaction was filtered through professional courtesy and strategic consideration. People said what they thought others wanted to hear, not what they actually felt. But Sarah's accidental honesty had created a space for something more real. Are you here with Little Miracles long term?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about her story. "Just temporarily," Sarah replied, and Marcus caught a flicker of something, disappointment, relief, in her expression. "I'm in school, actually. Nursing program at UCSF. Rosa lets me bring Jamie here on days when my regular babysitter isn't available, and I help out with the other kids in exchange." The information filled in some pieces of the puzzle Marcus had been unconsciously assembling. A single mother pursuing nursing school while caring for a toddler. No wonder she looked tired. The arrangement with Rosa spoke to the kind of community support that Marcus's privileged world rarely required. The networks of mutual aid that people created when formal systems weren't enough. "That's ambitious," Marcus said, and he meant it. "Nursing school is demanding under the best circumstances." "It's what I've always wanted to do," Sarah replied, and Marcus heard the quiet determination in her voice. "Help people, you know. Make a difference in a way that matters." Before Marcus could respond, Jamie made another grab for his tie, this time managing to pull it askew. Sarah reached out quickly to stop him, her hand briefly brushing against Marcus's as she untangled the small fingers from the silk fabric. "I'm so sorry," she said, smoothing Marcus's tie back into place with an efficiency that suggested she was used to managing small disasters. "He's fascinated by anything shiny or colorful." The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through Marcus, a reminder of how long it had been since he'd experienced casual human touch. Victoria had stopped reaching for him months before their marriage ended, and the sterile handshakes of business meetings hardly counted as meaningful physical connection. Sarah's touch was unconscious, maternal, focused entirely on managing her son's behavior rather than any awareness of Marcus as a man. But it left him feeling strangely awakened, as if nerve endings he'd forgotten he possessed had suddenly come back to life. "It's fine," Marcus said, and realized he meant it completely. A few hours ago, a baby grabbing his tie would have been an annoyance, a disruption to his carefully maintained professional image. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Rosa Martinez appeared beside them, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone used to managing multiple conversations simultaneously while keeping track of dozens of children. "I see you've met Sarah and Jamie," she said to Marcus with obvious pleasure. "Sarah's been a godsend for us. She has a real gift with the children, and Jamie here is our little mascot." Marcus looked between Rosa and Sarah, sensing layers of relationship and history that spoke to the kind of extended family networks he'd read about but never experienced. In his world, professional relationships stayed professional and personal connections were carefully compartmentalized. But here was evidence of something different. A community where people supported each other across traditional boundaries, where a nursing student could find childcare in exchange for help, where a temporary relocation became an opportunity for connection rather than merely a problem to be solved. "Rosa's been incredible," Sarah said, and Marcus heard genuine gratitude in her voice. "I don't know what I would have done without this place when my regular arrangements fell through." "What we do here isn't just about childcare," Rosa explained. To Marcus, it's about creating community, helping families support each other. Parents like Sarah, who are working towards something better, they need more than just a safe place for their children. They need understanding, flexibility, people who believe in their dreams. The philosophy behind Little Miracles was clearly something Rosa was passionate about, and Marcus found himself genuinely interested in understanding how such a place operated. In his business world, everything was measured by profit margins and efficiency metrics. But Rosa was describing something that couldn't be easily quantified: the value of human connection, the investment in potential rather than just immediate returns. "It sounds like important work," Marcus said, and meant it. "It is," Rosa replied simply. "Every child who comes through here has the potential to change the world, if they're given the right foundation. Parents like Sarah, they're not just raising their own children, they're preparing the next generation of healers, teachers, leaders. We just try to make that work a little easier." Marcus looked at Sarah, who was listening to Rosa's words, with a mixture of pride and something that looked like determination. Jamie had settled in her lap, content to play with a small toy car while the adults talked. There was something profound about the scene: a young mother pursuing her education while caring for her child, supported by a community that believed in her potential for contribution. It was so different from Marcus's own experience of achievement, which had been largely solitary and competitive. He'd succeeded by outworking competitors, by being smarter and more ruthless than the people around him. The idea of success as a collective effort of individual achievement being made possible by community support was foreign to his understanding of how the world worked. "Where's Jamie's father?" Marcus heard himself asking, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." Sarah's expression tightened slightly, and Marcus saw her arms close protectively around Jamie. Rosa stepped closer, a subtle movement that suggested she was prepared to intervene if necessary. It was clearly a sensitive topic, one that required careful handling. "Jamie's father was deployed overseas," Sarah said after a moment, her voice carefully controlled. "He died in Afghanistan when Jamie was 6 months old." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Suddenly, the patient voice teaching a baby to say "daddy" took on an entirely different meaning. This wasn't a case of abandonment or divorce. This was a young widow trying to keep her husband's memory alive for a child who would never know his father. The dedication Marcus had observed from his office window became something much more profound: a mother's determination to ensure that her son would grow up knowing he was loved by a man who had died defending his country. "I'm so sorry," Marcus said, the corporate condolences he was used to offering seeming completely inadequate for the magnitude of Sarah's loss. "I can't imagine how difficult that must be." "We manage," Sarah replied, her voice steady, but Marcus could see the effort it took to maintain that composure. "David wanted so much to be a father. He used to talk to my belly when I was pregnant, telling Jamie all the things they would do together when he got home. I just want to make sure Jamie knows that his daddy loved him, even if he can't be here, to show it." The image of a soldier talking to his unborn child, making plans for a future he would never see, created an ache in Marcus's chest that he hadn't expected. This was love at its most selfless and most tragic. A man preparing to be a father while serving his country. A woman left to raise their child with nothing but memories and determination. Marcus thought about his own father, who had been physically present but emotionally absent, too focused on building business success to invest in the relationship with his son. Here was a man who had wanted desperately to be a father, but had been taken by circumstances beyond his control, leaving behind a woman who was working heroically to honor his memory and his dreams. "How do you do it?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about the strength required to carry such a burden. "How do you find the energy to keep going?" Sarah looked down at Jamie, who had fallen asleep in her lap, his small face peaceful and trusting. When she looked back up at Marcus, there was something fierce and beautiful in her expression. "Because he's counting on me," she said simply. "David and Jamie both. I can't give up because they need me to succeed. Jamie needs to grow up knowing that his parents were people worth being proud of. And David, I made him a promise that I would take care of our son, that I would make sure Jamie became the kind of man his father would have been proud to know." The quiet strength in Sarah's voice created a silence that felt sacred, as if Marcus had been allowed to witness something precious and private. Rosa wiped her eyes discreetly, clearly moved by words she had probably heard before, but that never lost their power. Even in sleep, Jamie seemed to embody the hope and determination that his mother carried, a child who would grow up knowing he was the product of extraordinary love and sacrifice. Marcus realized that his own problems, the loneliness of divorce, the emptiness of professional success, seemed almost trivial in comparison to what Sarah faced every day. She was building a future for herself and her son from almost nothing, motivated by love for people both living and dead, driven by a sense of purpose that his corporate achievements had never provided. As parents continued to collect their children, around them, the daycare slowly emptied until only a few families remained. Sarah gathered Jamie's belongings with practiced efficiency, preparing for what Marcus assumed was a commute home on public transportation. The contrast between his life and hers was stark. He would ride a private elevator to a luxury car in a secured parking garage, while she would carry a sleeping toddler and a diaper bag onto a bus or train for a journey that probably took the better part of an hour. "Can I give you a ride home?" Marcus found himself offering, the words coming out before he'd consciously decided to speak them. Sarah looked up in surprise, and Marcus saw her instinctive wariness. A successful businessman offering rides to single mothers was probably not something that happened in her world without ulterior motives. Rosa stepped closer, her protective instincts clearly activated by the unexpected offer. "That's very kind," Sarah said carefully, "but we're fine. The bus stop is just a few blocks away." Marcus realized his offer had been clumsy, possibly even inappropriate. He was a stranger, despite their brief conversation, and Sarah had every reason to be cautious about accepting help from someone she'd just met. But the thought of her carrying a sleeping child through the city streets while he drove home alone to his empty penthouse apartment seemed wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. "I'm sorry," Marcus said quickly. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I just thought, it's late and you have a lot to carry." "Mr. Chen," Rosa interjected gently, "it's a very thoughtful offer, but I think Sarah's right to be careful. She doesn't know you yet." The word "yet" hung in the air with interesting implications. Rosa seemed to be suggesting that this might not be the end of their interaction, that there could be future opportunities for Marcus to prove himself trustworthy. It was a small kindness, a way of declining his offer without completely closing the door on future connection. "Of course," Marcus said, feeling foolish for having made the suggestion. "I understand completely." The morning fog rolled across San Francisco Bay like a gray blanket, obscuring the tops of the financial district's towers in a way that made the city feel smaller, more intimate. Marcus stood at his office window with a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, watching the familiar dance of commuters beginning their day 42 floors below. 3 days had passed since his unexpected visit to the temporary daycare, but the memory of Sarah Williams and her son Jamie had taken up permanent residence in his thoughts in a way that no business deal or corporate strategy ever had. Patricia knocked softly on his door before entering, carrying a stack of documents that required his signature, and wearing the slightly concerned expression she reserved for moments when she felt her employer was behaving uncharacteristically. Marcus had been distracted all week, arriving later than usual, leaving meetings early, and spending long periods staring out the window instead of focusing on the quarterly reports that normally commanded his complete attention. "The Morrison Group contracts are ready for your review," Patricia said, setting the papers on his desk with her usual efficiency. "And I have Rosa Martinez holding on line 3. She says it's about a donation request." Marcus felt his pulse quicken at the mention of Rosa's name, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. He hadn't expected to hear from the daycare director again, and the mention of a donation request created both anticipation and uncertainty. In his corporate world, donation requests were routine, usually handled by his assistant according to predetermined charitable giving guidelines. But this felt personal in a way that made standard procedures seem inadequate. "I'll take the call," Marcus said, reaching for the phone before Patricia had fully left the room. "Mr. Chen." Rosa's warm voice came through the speaker with its familiar maternal quality. "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. I know how busy you must be." "Not at all, Rosa. What can I do for you?" "Well, I'm calling because we've had an unexpected opportunity, and I thought you might be interested in hearing about it. You seemed genuinely concerned about what we do here when you visited the other day." Marcus settled back in his chair, genuinely curious about what Rosa had in mind. Her tone suggested this wasn't a routine fundraising call, but something more specific that she thought might appeal to him personally. "The San Francisco Community Foundation has offered us a matching grant," Rosa continued. "If we can raise $15,000 by the end of next month, they'll match it dollar for dollar. The money would go toward establishing a permanent scholarship fund for single parents in education programs, like our Sarah." The mention of Sarah's name sent a jolt through Marcus that he hoped wasn't apparent in his voice. "That sounds like an excellent program. What kind of support are you looking for?" "Any amount would be helpful, of course, but I was actually hoping you might consider something a bit different. Instead of just writing a check, would you be interested in helping us organize a fundraising event? Something that would bring the community together and help people understand what we're really trying to accomplish here." The request was unexpected and intriguing. Marcus had organized countless corporate events, product launches, and client appreciation dinners, but a community fundraiser for a daycare center was entirely outside his experience. The idea of using his professional skills for something genuinely meaningful rather than merely profitable appealed to him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "What did you have in mind?" Marcus asked, already finding himself mentally cataloging the resources and connections that could be brought to bear on such a project. "Nothing too elaborate," Rosa said quickly, as if she were afraid he might be put off by the scope of the undertaking. "Maybe a dinner, some speakers, an auction of donated items. The goal would be to tell our story, help people understand why this work matters, and raise enough money to qualify for the matching grant." Marcus found himself nodding, though Rosa couldn't see him. The concept was sound, and he could already envision how his corporate event planning experience could be adapted to serve this very different purpose. More importantly, it would give him a legitimate reason to spend time around little miracles, around the kind of meaningful work that was so different from his usual corporate environment. "I'd be interested in helping," Marcus said, the decision forming as he spoke. "When would you want to hold this event? Could we meet sometime this week to discuss the details?" I'd love to have Sarah involved in the planning too, since she's exactly the kind of person the scholarship fund would support. Her perspective would be invaluable. The prospect of working closely with Sarah on a project that could benefit her directly created a mix of excitement and nervousness that Marcus hadn't felt since his early days building the company. This wasn't the familiar territory of boardrooms and profit margins, but something more personal and immediately meaningful. "I'm free Thursday afternoon," Marcus offered. "Would that work for a planning meeting?" "Perfect. Why don't you come down to our temporary space around 2 o'clock? Sarah will be here with Jamie, and we can brainstorm while the children are having quiet time." After hanging up, Marcus sat in his office feeling energized in a way that no business meeting had inspired in months. The prospect of organizing an event that could genuinely help people like Sarah pursue their dreams felt more compelling than any corporate deal he'd negotiated recently. There was something pure about the motivation, uncomplicated by the complex financial incentives and competitive pressures that usually drove his professional decisions. Thursday afternoon arrived with unusual speed, and Marcus found himself anticipating the planning meeting with an enthusiasm that surprised him. He had spent the intervening days researching fundraising strategies, reaching out to contacts who might be able to donate auction items, and sketching preliminary event concepts that could showcase Little Miracle's mission effectively. The temporary daycare was quieter than it had been during his previous visit, with most of the children settled on mats for afternoon rest time. Sarah sat in the same corner where he'd first seen her up close, reading quietly while Jamie slept curled against her side. She looked up as Marcus approached, offering a smile that seemed more relaxed than their first meeting, as if Rosa had reassured her about his intentions. "Mr. Chen," Sarah said softly, careful not to wake the sleeping toddler. "Rosa told me about your fundraising idea. It's incredibly generous of you to want to help." "Please call me Marcus," he replied, settling into a small chair that had clearly been designed for someone much shorter. "And it's not entirely altruistic. I've been looking for ways to get more involved in the community, and this seems like a perfect opportunity." Rosa joined them, carrying a folder filled with information about Little Miracle's programs and a legal pad covered with notes about potential event concepts. Her face carried the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone who was used to operating on limited resources and was still adjusting to the possibility of more substantial support. "I've been thinking about venues," Rosa began, consulting her notes. "The community center where we held our last fundraiser can accommodate about 60 people, but if we're hoping to reach the $15,000 goal, we might need something larger." Marcus had anticipated this challenge and had spent some time researching options that could work within a non-profit budget. "Actually, I might be able to help with the venue question. Chen Industries has access to several event spaces through our corporate partnerships. There's a beautiful room at the Marriott that overlooks the bay, and I think I could arrange for us to use it at no cost." The offer clearly surprised both women, and Marcus saw them exchange glances that suggested they were recalibrating their expectations for what this fundraiser might become. Sarah shifted Jamie carefully to her other arm, her expression thoughtful, as she processed the implications of a much more upscale venue. "That's incredibly generous," Sarah said, "but I'm worried about making the event too fancy. The people who would benefit from this scholarship fund, families like mine, they might feel intimidated by a really formal setting." Her concern revealed a sensitivity to class dynamics that Marcus hadn't fully considered, and he found himself impressed by her thoughtfulness about potential unintended consequences. In his corporate world, bigger and more expensive was usually assumed to be better, but Sarah was thinking about the psychological impact on the very people the event was meant to serve. That's a really good point, Marcus acknowledged. Maybe we could find a middle ground, nice enough to attract donors who are used to upscale events, but welcoming enough that scholarship recipients feel comfortable attending. What about the Palace of Fine Arts? Rosa suggested. It's beautiful and prestigious enough to impress donors, but it's also a public space that doesn't feel exclusive. Plus, it has that wonderful outdoor area where families could bring their children. The suggestion sparked immediate enthusiasm from all three planners. The Palace of Fine Arts offered the perfect combination of elegance and accessibility with stunning architecture that would create an impressive backdrop for the fundraiser, while maintaining the community-focused atmosphere that was central to Little Miracle's mission. "I love that idea," Sarah said, her eyes lighting up with genuine excitement. "Jamie loves being outdoors, and I think other parents would appreciate being able to bring their kids instead of having to arrange additional childcare." Marcus found himself watching Sarah's animated expression as she described her vision for the event, noting how her entire demeanor changed when she talked about something she cared about deeply. The tired wariness that seemed to be her default expression disappeared, replaced by an enthusiasm that made her appear younger and more vibrant. It was a reminder that beneath the challenges of single motherhood and financial struggle was a passionate, intelligent woman with dreams and opinions that extended far beyond her immediate circumstances. "So we're thinking Palace of Fine Arts for the venue," Marcus said, making notes on his own legal pad. "What about the program itself? Rosa mentioned speakers and an auction." "I'd love to have some of our scholarship recipients speak," Rosa said. "People like Sarah who can talk about what this kind of support means in real terms. Sometimes donors need to hear specific stories to understand why their contributions matter." Sarah's expression shifted slightly, and Marcus caught a flicker of uncertainty that suggested public speaking wasn't something she felt comfortable with. The idea of sharing her personal story with a room full of strangers, particularly wealthy, strangers who might judge her circumstances, was clearly daunting. "I'm not really a public speaker," Sarah said quietly. "I wouldn't know what to say or how to make it interesting for people who probably have very different lives." "You don't need to be polished," Marcus found himself saying. "The most powerful thing you could do is just tell the truth about your experience. People respond to authenticity, especially when it's about something as fundamental as a parent working to build a better future for their child." As he spoke, Marcus realized he was drawing on professional experience while addressing something deeply personal. In his corporate presentations, he'd learned that genuine passion was more persuasive than polished technique, and Sarah's story had the kind of authentic emotional impact that no amount of professional coaching could create. "Maybe we could practice together," Rosa suggested gently. "Work on telling your story in a way that feels comfortable for you, and Marcus could give you some tips about speaking to larger groups." The suggestion created an opportunity for ongoing collaboration that appealed to Marcus more than he wanted to admit. The prospect of spending time helping Sarah prepare for the presentation offered a legitimate reason to see her regularly, to understand more about her experiences and perspectives. "I'd be happy to help with that," Marcus said, trying to keep his tone professionally neutral despite his personal interest. Presentation skills are transferable, whether you're talking to corporate executives or community donors. They spent the next hour sketching out a preliminary timeline for the event, identifying potential auction items, and discussing marketing strategies that could reach both traditional donors and the broader community that Little Miracles served. Marcus found himself impressed by both women's understanding of their constituency and their realistic assessment of what could be accomplished within their limited time frame. Sarah proved to have particularly good instincts about what would appeal to families in circumstances similar to her own, suggesting elements like a children's art display and a resource fair where attendees could learn about other community support programs. Her ideas transformed the fundraiser from a simple donation request into a genuine community-building event that could provide value to attendees regardless of their ability to contribute financially. "What about corporate sponsorships?" Marcus asked, thinking about his business network and the companies that might be willing to provide financial support in exchange for recognition at the event. "We've never really pursued corporate sponsors before," Rosa admitted. "I wouldn't know how to approach them or what to offer in return." "That's something I could definitely help with," Marcus said, already mentally cataloging companies that might be interested in associating themselves with Little Miracle's mission. A lot of businesses are looking for meaningful community partnerships, especially ones that align with family values and education. As the planning session continued, Marcus found himself increasingly impressed by the depth of thought that both women brought to the project. Rosa's decades of experience working with families in crisis had given her insights into community dynamics that no business school could teach, while Sarah's perspective, as someone who had actually benefited from the programs they were trying to fund, provided crucial grounding in practical reality. When Jamie woke from his nap and immediately reached for Marcus with the kind of unreserved affection that only very young children possess, the planning session took on a more relaxed quality. Marcus found himself holding the toddler while continuing to discuss event logistics, an experience that felt both foreign and surprisingly natural. "He really likes you," Sarah observed, watching as Jamie played with Marcus's tie with obvious delight. "Usually he's shy around new people, but he warmed up to you immediately. Maybe he senses that Marcus is one of the good ones," Rosa said with a knowing smile. "Children are excellent judges of character." The comment created a moment of connection that felt significant despite its casual delivery. Marcus realized that he was being evaluated not just as a potential business partner, but as a person whose character was being assessed through the lens of how he interacted with a vulnerable child. It was a test he hadn't known he was taking, and passing it seemed more important than any corporate evaluation he'd ever faced. "I should probably head back upstairs," Marcus said reluctantly, handing Jamie back to Sarah with a gentleness that surprised him. "But this has been incredibly productive. Should we plan to meet again next week to finalize the details?" "That would be perfect," Rosa agreed. "And Marcus, I can't tell you how much this means to our families. Having someone with your resources and experience willing to invest in our mission, it's going to make all the difference." As Marcus rode the elevator back to his office, he found himself thinking about Rosa's words and the weight of responsibility they carried. People were counting on this fundraiser to succeed, not as an abstract charitable gesture, but as a concrete step toward better lives for themselves and their children. Sarah's nursing career, and by extension Jamie's future security, could be directly impacted by how well they executed this event. The pressure was different from anything Marcus had experienced in his corporate career. Business failures meant lost profits, disappointed shareholders, and damaged professional reputations, but the consequences were largely abstract and financial. This fundraiser carried the weight of real people's dreams and struggles, making success feel both more important and more personal than any deal he'd ever negotiated. Over the following days, Marcus threw himself into event planning with an intensity that surprised his staff. He scheduled meetings with potential corporate sponsors, researched catering options that could accommodate different dietary restrictions and budget constraints, and began reaching out to his network for auction item donations. The project consumed his attention in a way that made his usual business concerns seem mundane by comparison. Patricia noticed the change immediately, commenting that she hadn't seen him this energized about a project since the early days of building Chen Industries. The observation was more accurate than she probably realized. Marcus was rediscovering the satisfaction of building something from scratch. But this time the motivation was service rather than profit. The first major breakthrough came when Marcus approached Tech Forward, one of his largest clients, about sponsoring the event. The company's CEO, Jennifer Walsh, was a working mother herself and immediately connected with Little Miracle's mission of supporting parents in career transition. This is exactly the kind of community investment we've been looking for, Jennifer said during their lunch meeting at an upscale downtown restaurant. Too many corporate charitable programs feel disconnected from real impact. What you're describing sounds like it could genuinely change lives. Tech Forward's commitment to serve as the event's presenting sponsor provided both financial support and credibility that would help attract other donors. More importantly, it validated Marcus's instinct that there was significant community appetite for supporting programs like Little Miracles if they were presented effectively. The success with Tech Forward led to a series of similar conversations with other companies in Marcus's network, each resulting in commitments for either financial sponsorship or in-kind donations of services and auction items. Within 2 weeks, the event had evolved from a modest community gathering into a significant fundraising opportunity that could potentially exceed the $15,000 goal required for the matching grant. Marcus scheduled a follow-up meeting with Rosa and Sarah to share the good news and discuss how the expanded scope of the fundraiser would affect their planning. He found himself looking forward to the meeting with an anticipation that had less to do with business strategy and more to do with seeing Sarah again, though he was careful not to examine those feelings too closely. The temporary daycare was buzzing with activity when Marcus arrived for the scheduled meeting, with children engaged in various art projects that had transformed the space into a colorful explosion of creativity. Sarah was helping a small group of toddlers with finger painting, her clothes already decorated with bright splotches of blue and yellow paint that somehow made her look more beautiful rather than disheveled. "Marcus!" Jamie called out when he spotted the familiar figure, abandoning his own art project to toddle across the room with his arms outstretched. The enthusiastic greeting warmed Marcus's heart in a way that surprised him with its intensity. In his corporate world, relationships were typically measured and professional, built on mutual benefit rather than genuine affection. Jamie's uncomplicated joy at seeing him felt like a gift, a reminder of what human connection could look like when it wasn't filtered through strategic considerations. "Look what we made," Sarah said, indicating the collection of colorful handprints that decorated a large sheet of paper. "Jamie insisted on making one for you." She pointed to a small blue handprint in the corner of the paper, and Marcus felt an unexpected tightness in his throat as he looked at the tiny, perfect impression. No corporate award or professional recognition had ever moved him the way this simple gesture did. A child's instinctive desire to share something beautiful with someone he cared about. "That's incredible," Marcus said, kneeling down to Jamie's level. "Can I keep it?" The toddler nodded enthusiastically, clapping his paint-covered hands together in delight. Sarah carefully tore the section with Jamie's handprint from the larger paper, handing it to Marcus with a smile that suggested she understood the significance of the moment. "He's been talking about you all week," Sarah said as they moved to the quieter area where Rosa was waiting with her planning materials. "Well, as much as a 15-month-old can talk, but he definitely remembers you." The idea that he had made a lasting impression on Jamie created a warmth in Marcus's chest that felt both wonderful and slightly terrifying. He wasn't used to being important to people in ways that had nothing to do with his professional accomplishments, and the vulnerability of caring about a child's opinion felt both precious and dangerous. "So," Rosa said, settling into her chair, with obvious excitement, "tell us about these corporate sponsors you've been talking to." Marcus spent the next 30 minutes outlining the commitments he'd secured, watching as both women's expressions shifted from cautious optimism to genuine amazement as the scope of support became clear. By the time he finished describing Tech Forward's contribution and the additional sponsorships that were already confirmed, they were looking at the possibility of raising significantly more than the original $15,000 goal. "This is incredible," Sarah said, her voice filled with something that sounded like disbelief. "I never imagined that so many companies would be interested in supporting something like this." "You'd be surprised how many business leaders are looking for ways to make a meaningful impact in their communities," Marcus replied. "They just need to be presented with opportunities that align with their values and business objectives." "What does this mean for the scholarship fund?" Rosa asked, clearly trying to wrap her mind around the expanded possibilities. "Well, if we can raise 30,000 instead of 15 and the community foundation still matches it, we're looking at a total of $60,000. That could support a lot more students than we originally planned." The numbers represented life-changing possibilities for families like Sarah's, and Marcus could see her calculating what such support might mean for her own educational journey. The nursing program she was pursuing was expensive, and even with her current scholarship assistance, she was facing significant financial challenges that threatened her ability to complete her degree. "I keep thinking this is too good to be true," Sarah said quietly. "Things like this don't usually happen to people like me." Her comment revealed both hope and the kind of ingrained caution that came from experiencing disappointment, and Marcus felt a strong urge to reassure her that this opportunity was as real and solid as anything he'd ever built in his business. "Career. It's happening because you deserve it," Marcus said, his voice carrying more emotion than he'd intended. "You're working incredibly hard to build a better future for yourself and Jamie. This scholarship fund is just recognizing that investment and trying to make it a little easier." Sarah looked at him with an expression that suggested she was seeing him in a new light, perhaps recognizing that his support went beyond professional courtesy or charitable obligation. There was something personal in his commitment to this project, a genuine investment in her success that had less to do with tax benefits or corporate image than with authentic caring. "Thank you," she said simply, but Marcus heard layers of meaning in those two words that encompassed gratitude, surprise, and perhaps the beginning of trust. The planning session continued for another hour, with details about catering, entertainment, and logistics falling into place with remarkable efficiency. Marcus found himself watching Sarah as she contributed ideas and asked thoughtful questions, noting how her confidence grew as she became more involved in the planning process. This wasn't just something being done for her, but something she was actively helping to create. As the meeting concluded and parents began arriving for pickup time, Marcus realized that his involvement with Little Miracles had evolved far beyond a simple charitable donation. He was now deeply invested in the success of the fundraiser, in the scholarship program it would fund, and in the specific outcomes for Sarah and Jamie. The professional distance he typically maintained in business relationships had somehow disappeared, replaced by something more personal and infinitely more meaningful. Walking back to his office, Marcus carried with him both Jamie's handprint and a growing awareness that his life was changing in ways he hadn't anticipated. The corporate success that had once defined his entire identity was beginning to feel less important than the connections he was building with people whose values and struggles were teaching him what really mattered. The fundraising event was still 3 weeks away, but Marcus could already see that its impact would extend far beyond the money raised or the scholarships funded. For the first time in his adult life, he was part of something that was purely about helping others succeed, and the satisfaction he derived from that involvement was unlike anything his business achievements had ever provided. That evening, As Marcus sat in his empty penthouse apartment overlooking the San Francisco skyline, he found himself thinking not about quarterly projections or market analyses, but about a small blue handprint and the woman who had guided the tiny hand that made it. The corporate world that had once been his entire universe was beginning to feel like just one part of a much larger and more meaningful life, one that included community, connection, and the kind of purpose that couldn't be measured in profit. Margins. Jamie's handprint, carefully placed on his refrigerator next to schedules and business cards, served as a daily reminder that success could be defined by more than professional achievement. It was a symbol of the unexpected relationships that were reshaping his understanding of what it meant to live a life that mattered, and a promise of the continued transformation that lay ahead as he learned to balance corporate success with genuine human connection. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Palace of Fine Arts as Marcus arrived early to oversee the final preparations for the Little Miracles fundraising gala. 3 weeks of intensive planning had transformed what began as a modest community dinner into an elegant evening that promised to exceed everyone's expectations. Corporate sponsors had provided everything from professional lighting to gourmet catering, while local artists had donated pieces for an auction that featured items ranging from weekend getaways to custom jewelry. Marcus stood in the rotunda, adjusting his black tie while surveying the transformation of the space. Round tables draped in crisp white linens filled the main area, each centerpiece featuring photographs of Little Miracles children alongside handwritten notes about their dreams and aspirations. The auction display occupied an entire wall, professionally lit to showcase donations that represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential fundraising revenue. The scale of the event had grown far beyond what any of them had initially envisioned, and with that growth had come pressure that Marcus felt acutely. This wasn't just about raising money anymore, it was about validating his promise to Sarah that her dreams were worth fighting for, about proving to Rosa that her faith in him had been justified, and about demonstrating to himself that his corporate skills could be used for something genuinely meaningful. Patricia approached with her clipboard and the slightly frazzled expression she wore when managing complex logistics. She had thrown herself into the event planning with characteristic efficiency, coordinating with vendors and sponsors while maintaining Marcus's regular business schedule. The dual demands had created long days for everyone involved, but Patricia seemed energized by work that felt more personally meaningful than the usual corporate functions. "The caterers are setting up in the kitchen area," Patricia reported, consulting her detailed timeline. "Rosa and Sarah should be arriving within the hour for the final walkthrough. The photographer from the Chronicle will be here at 6, and guests start arriving at 7. Marcus nodded, though his attention was partially focused on watching for Sarah's arrival. Over the past 3 weeks, their planning meetings had become the highlight of his schedule. Opportunities to see her growing confidence as she prepared for her speaking role, and to witness her excitement about the scholarship fund that could transform her educational journey. The relationship between them had evolved during those planning sessions, moving from polite collaboration to something that felt more like genuine friendship. Sarah had initially been intimidated by Marcus's corporate background and obvious wealth, but as they worked together on presentation skills and event logistics, she had begun to see past his professional persona to the person underneath. Marcus had been equally surprised by the depth of Sarah's intelligence and insight. Her nursing background gave her a perspective on community needs that informed every aspect of the event planning, while her experience as a single mother provided practical wisdom about the challenges facing the families they were trying to help. She wasn't just the beneficiary of the scholarship program, she was an active partner in creating something that could help many other families facing similar struggles. The sound of voices in the entrance hall announced the arrival of the Little Miracles team, and Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he recognized Sarah's laugh among the group. When she appeared in the rotunda doorway, his breath caught in a way that had nothing to do with the professional stakes of the evening, and everything to do with how beautiful she looked in the simple black dress Rosa had helped her select for the occasion. Sarah had been nervous about finding appropriate attire for such an upscale event, worried that she didn't own anything suitable for addressing a room full of wealthy donors. Rosa had solved the problem by taking her shopping at a consignment store that specialized in professional clothing, finding a dress that was both elegant and comfortable within Sarah's limited budget. The transformation was remarkable, not because the dress was expensive or fashionable, but because Sarah wore it with a confidence that Marcus hadn't seen before. The nervous young mother he'd first met had evolved into someone who belonged in this elegant setting, who had something valuable to contribute to the conversations that would take place that evening. "Marcus," Sarah said, approaching with Jamie, in her arms and a smile that lit up the entire space. "This is incredible. I can't believe you made all of this happen." Jamie immediately reached for Marcus with the enthusiastic greeting that had become their routine, and Marcus found himself holding the toddler while Sarah looked around the room with obvious amazement. The sight of her taking in the elegant decorations and professional setup created a satisfaction in Marcus that exceeded anything he'd felt during his most successful business launches. "We made this happen," Marcus corrected, shifting Jamie to a more comfortable position. "Your story is what's going to inspire people tonight. Everything else is just window dressing." Rosa joined them, carrying a small bag that Marcus recognized as containing the speech notes they had worked on together during their practice sessions. Over the past 2 weeks, Sarah had transformed from someone who was terrified of public speaking into a presenter who could tell her story with both authenticity and impact. "How are you feeling about tonight?" Marcus asked Sarah, noting the slight nervousness in her expression despite her obvious excitement about the event. "Scared and excited at the same time," Sarah admitted. "I've never spoken to a group this large before, and definitely not about something so personal. But I keep thinking about what this scholarship fund could mean for other families, and that makes it easier." Her response revealed the growth in perspective that Marcus had watched develop over the weeks of preparation. Initially, Sarah had been focused primarily on her own need for educational support, which was natural and appropriate given her circumstances. But as she learned more about the broader impact of the scholarship program, she had begun to see herself as part of a larger community of parents working to build better futures for their children. The next hour passed quickly as they conducted final walkthroughs and addressed last-minute logistics. The catering staff transformed the adjacent space into an elegant reception area, while technicians tested sound equipment and lighting systems that would ensure Sarah's presentation could be heard and seen clearly by everyone in attendance. Marcus found himself stealing glances at Sarah as she moved through the space, noting how she interacted with the various staff members with genuine warmth and appreciation. She thanked everyone personally, from the lighting technicians to the floral arrangers, treating each person as if their contribution was essential to the evening's success. It was a quality of character that impressed Marcus more than any business credential could have. As 6 o'clock approached, the first guests began arriving for the cocktail reception that would precede the formal program. Marcus had strategically invited a mix of corporate leaders, community activists, and Little Miracles families, hoping to create conversations that would bridge different perspectives and build broader support for the organization's mission. The early arrivals included several of Marcus's business contacts, CEOs, and senior executives who had responded to his personal invitations with curiosity about his sudden involvement in community work. Jennifer Walsh from Tech Forward was among The first to arrive, approaching Marcus with the kind of knowing smile that suggested she understood there was more to his commitment than simple charitable obligation. "So this is the organization that's captured your attention," Jennifer said, looking around the elegant setup with obvious approval. "I have to say, Marcus, I've never seen you this invested in anything outside of Chen Industries." Her observation was accurate and slightly uncomfortable, highlighting how dramatically his priorities had shifted over the past month. Marcus had always maintained strict boundaries between his professional and personal life, but his involvement with Little Miracles had made such separation impossible. "It's important work," Marcus replied, which was true but didn't fully explain the depth of his commitment. "These families are working incredibly hard to build better lives, and they deserve support." Jennifer said, her tone suggesting she suspected there was more to the story. "And is that the young woman you mentioned, the one who'll be speaking tonight?" Marcus followed Jennifer's gaze to where Sarah stood near the auction display, holding Jamie while explaining one of the children's art pieces to an older couple who had stopped to admire the colorful creation. Even from across the room, her enthusiasm and genuine passion for the work were evident. "That's Sarah Williams," Marcus confirmed. "She's a nursing student and one of the scholarship recipients. Her story is remarkable." Jennifer studied Sarah for a moment, then looked back at Marcus with an expression that suggested she was beginning to understand the personal dimension of his involvement. "She's lovely," Jennifer said simply, "and clearly dedicated to her son and her education. I can see why you're committed to helping her succeed." The conversation was interrupted by Rosa's approach, her face glowing with excitement as she took in the growing crowd of elegantly dressed guests. The transformation of her small community organization's fundraising dreams into this sophisticated event still seemed to amaze her, and she moved through the reception with the wonder of someone seeing possibilities she'd never imagined. "Marcus, I can't thank you enough for making this possible," Rosa said, her voice filled with emotion. "We're already hearing from guests about their interest in ongoing support, not just for tonight's fundraising goal." The evening was proceeding exactly as Marcus had hoped, with donors engaging in meaningful conversations about Little Miracles' mission while enjoying the elegant atmosphere that demonstrated the organization's professionalism and worthiness of support. Corporate sponsors were making connections with potential new partners, while families served by the organization were sharing their stories with people who had the resources to help. As the reception continued, Marcus found himself gravitating towards Sarah, who was handling her first formal networking event with impressive grace. She moved between conversations with Jamie on her hip, answering questions about her nursing program and the challenges of balancing education with single parenthood. Her natural warmth and authenticity were winning over donors who might otherwise view scholarship recipients as abstract beneficiaries rather than real people with compelling stories. "You're a natural at this," Marcus told Sarah during a brief pause between conversations. "These donors are really connecting with your story." "It helps that it's my real life," Sarah replied with a smile. "I don't have to pretend or try to be impressive. I just tell the truth about what it's like to pursue a dream while raising a child alone." Her comment highlighted the contrast between their worlds that Marcus was becoming increasingly aware of. In his corporate environment, success often required careful image management and strategic presentation of information. But Sarah's power as a speaker came from her willingness to be completely honest about her struggles and hopes, creating connections that no amount of professional polish could achieve. The formal program began at 8 o'clock, with guests taking their seats at the beautifully appointed tables while Marcus stepped to the podium to welcome everyone and introduce the evening's purpose. Looking out at the audience of more than 200 people, he felt a nervousness that was entirely different from his usual business presentations. This wasn't about profit margins or market strategies. It was about human lives and dreams that deserved support. Good evening, and thank you all for joining us for what I hope will be the first annual Little Miracles Scholarship Gala, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. 3 months ago, I had never heard of Little Miracles Child Development Center. Today, I can't imagine my life without the remarkable people who make up this organization and the families they serve. He went on to describe his introduction to the organization and his growing understanding of the vital role they played in supporting families pursuing education and career advancement. The speech felt more personal than any presentation he'd ever given, reflecting genuine emotion rather than calculated persuasion. Rosa followed with an overview of Little Miracles programs and the specific impact that scholarship support could have on families working to break cycles of poverty through education. Her presentation was both informative and moving, highlighting success stories while acknowledging the ongoing challenges that made continued support essential. When Sarah took the podium, carrying Jamie with her because he had become fussy when separated from her, the room fell into an attentive silence that suggested the audience recognized they were about to hear something significant. Marcus watched from his table as Sarah adjusted the microphone and looked out at the crowd with a composure that belied her earlier nervousness. "My name is Sarah Williams, and this is my son Jamie," she began, her voice steady and clear. 18 months ago, Jamie's father was killed serving our country in Afghanistan. 6 months later, I found myself a widow with a baby, no college degree, and dreams that seemed impossible to achieve on my own. The opening was powerful in its simplicity, immediately establishing both the tragedy that had shaped her circumstances and the determination that drove her forward. Marcus found himself holding his breath as Sarah continued, describing her decision to pursue nursing despite the challenges of single parenthood and limited resources. When people ask me why I chose nursing, especially given how difficult it is to manage school with a baby, I tell them that I want Jamie to grow up knowing that his parents were people who helped others. His father served his country because he believed in protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. I want to serve my community by caring for people who need healing. The connection she drew between her husband's military service and her own career aspirations created a narrative thread that elevated her personal story into something larger about service and sacrifice. Marcus could see guests wiping their eyes as Sarah described the challenges of studying for exams while Jamie was teething, or bringing him to clinical rotations when childcare fell through. The scholarship support I've received from Little Miracles hasn't just helped with tuition costs, Sarah continued, shifting Jamie to her other arm with practiced ease. It's given me something even more valuable, the belief that my dreams matter, that a single mother's education is worth investing in, that Jamie and I deserve a chance to build the life his father wanted for us. The speech was exactly what Marcus had hoped for when he encouraged Sarah to focus on authenticity rather than polish. Her words carried the kind of emotional truth that no professional presentation could replicate, creating connections between donors and the real impact of their potential contributions. As Sarah concluded her remarks and received enthusiastic applause from the audience, Marcus felt a pride that had nothing to do with his own role in organizing the event and everything to do with watching someone he cared about succeed in a challenging situation. The nervous young woman who had worried about public speaking had just delivered one of the most compelling presentations he'd ever witnessed. The auction portion of the evening proceeded with remarkable success, with bidding wars developing over several high-value items as guests competed to demonstrate their support for the scholarship fund. A weekend at a Napa Valley resort donated by one of Marcus's business contacts eventually sold for 3 times its estimated value, while a custom jewelry piece attracted bids from multiple tables before reaching a final price that drew gasps from the audience. By the time the formal program concluded, preliminary calculations suggested they had exceeded their most optimistic fundraising projections. The combination of corporate sponsorships, individual donations, and auction proceeds would easily surpass the $30,000 goal that Marcus had set, potentially creating a scholarship fund large enough to support dozens of students over multiple years. As guests began to leave, many stopped to speak personally with Sarah, offering encouragement for her nursing career and expressing interest in following her progress. Business cards were exchanged, potential mentoring relationships were discussed, and Sarah found herself at the center of a growing network of supporters who were invested in her success beyond just financial contributions. Marcus watched these interactions with satisfaction, recognizing that the evening had accomplished more than just fundraising. It had created genuine connections between different parts of the community, building relationships that could provide ongoing support for Little Miracles families long after the initial enthusiasm of the gala had faded. Rosa approached Marcus as the crowd thinned, her face glowing with exhaustion and exhilaration in equal measure. "I don't have words for what you've made possible tonight," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This isn't just about the money, though that's wonderful. It's about the relationships, the connections, the way you've helped our families feel valued and supported." Her gratitude was deeply meaningful to Marcus, but his attention was primarily focused on Sarah, who was saying goodbye to the last few guests while Jamie dozed against her shoulder. The evening had been a triumph for her personally, demonstrating that she could hold her own in any professional setting, while maintaining the authentic warmth that made her story so compelling. "Sarah!" Marcus called out as she prepared to leave. "Could I give you and Jamie a ride home? It's been a long evening and I imagine you're exhausted." The offer was practical and considerate, but Marcus found himself hoping she would accept for reasons that had less to do with transportation logistics and more to do with extending their time together. The evening had been professionally successful, but it had also highlighted feelings that he had been trying to ignore since their first meeting. "That's very kind," Sarah replied, and Marcus heard something in her voice that suggested she was as reluctant to end the evening as he was. "Jamie's pretty worn out, and I have to admit, I'm not looking forward to wrestling with his car seat on the bus." The drive through San Francisco's quiet evening streets provided an opportunity for them to decompress from the intensity of the gala while sharing observations about the evening's success. Jamie slept peacefully in his car seat, occasionally making the soft sounds that indicated happy dreams, while Sarah and Marcus talked about the connections she'd made and the potential opportunities that might emerge from the networking. "I still can't believe how many people wanted to talk to me tonight," Sarah said, looking out at the city lights as they drove through her neighborhood. "I was so worried about not fitting in, about saying the wrong thing or seeming ungrateful. But everyone was so genuine, so interested in actually hearing about my experience." "You were incredible up there," Marcus said, his voice carrying more emotion than he'd intended. "Watching you tell your story, seeing how people responded to your honesty and strength, it was one of the most powerful things I've ever witnessed." Sarah turned to look at him, and in the dim light of the car, Marcus could see something in her expression that suggested she was seeing him differently than she had before. The professional distance that had characterized their early interactions had gradually dissolved over the weeks of planning, replaced by something that felt more personal and infinitely more complex. "Thank you," she said quietly, "not just for tonight, but for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. When you first approached me about speaking, I thought you were crazy, I couldn't imagine that anyone would want to hear about my problems, or that my story could inspire anyone else. Your story isn't about problems, Marcus replied, pulling up in front of the modest apartment building where Sarah lived. It's about courage, determination, and love that's strong enough to overcome impossible circumstances. That's the kind of story that changes people's perspectives about what's possible. They sat in the car for a moment after he turned off the engine, neither of them seeming eager to end the conversation despite the late hour and Jamie's need for his own bed. The success of the evening had created a shared accomplishment that felt significant beyond its charitable purpose, a collaboration that had revealed depths of compatibility neither of them had expected. "Would you like to come up for coffee?" Sarah asked, the invitation carrying a note of uncertainty that suggested she wasn't entirely sure she should be making the offer. "I mean, if you're not too tired. I feel like I'm still too wired to sleep, and I'd love to talk more about what happens next with the scholarship program." The invitation was framed as a practical discussion about program logistics, but Marcus heard undertones that suggested Sarah was as reluctant to end their evening together as he was. The boundaries between professional collaboration and personal connection had been blurring for weeks, and tonight's shared success had brought them to a point where those boundaries felt increasingly artificial. "I'd like that," Marcus said, his decision made before he'd fully considered the implications of accepting. Sarah's apartment was a small one-bedroom space that had been creatively organized to accommodate both adult and child needs within severe space constraints. A corner of the living room had been converted into Jamie's sleeping area, with a crib positioned to catch morning light from the single window while maintaining privacy from the main living space. Textbooks were stacked on every available surface, evidence of Sarah's ongoing nursing studies, while children's toys were neatly organized in baskets that could be easily moved when space was needed for other purposes. The apartment was clean and well organized, but it spoke to the financial constraints that made Sarah's educational goals so challenging to achieve. Marcus couldn't help contrasting the modest space with his own penthouse apartment, recognizing that Sarah had created a warm, nurturing home with resources that represented a fraction of what he spent on monthly maintenance fees. "It's not much," Sarah said, settling Jamie into his crib with practiced efficiency while Marcus looked around the small space. "But it's ours, and we're comfortable here. It's lovely," Marcus said, and meant it completely. The apartment had a warmth and sense of purpose that his own much larger living space lacked, evidence of a life being actively lived rather than simply maintained. Sarah moved to the small kitchen area and began preparing coffee with movements that spoke to established routines adapted to limited space. Marcus found himself watching her navigate the compact environment with efficiency born of necessity, noting how she had learned to make the most of every square foot. "I keep thinking about what you said tonight, about this being just the beginning," Sarah said, as she measured coffee grounds. "What did you mean by that?" Marcus had been thinking about the same question throughout the evening, recognizing that the success of the gala had created possibilities that extended far beyond the immediate scholarship fund. The connections Sarah had made, the relationships that had been built, the demonstration of community support for Little Miracle's mission, all of these suggested potential for ongoing impact that could transform not just individual lives, but the broader approach to supporting families in transition. "I think what happened tonight proved that there's real appetite in this community for supporting programs like Little Miracles," Marcus said, accepting the coffee mug she offered and settling onto the small couch that dominated the living room. "The scholarship fund we created is wonderful, but it's just one piece of what could be a much larger network of support." "What kind of network?" Sarah asked, curling up in the apartment's single armchair with her own mug, her expression indicating genuine curiosity about his vision. Mentorship programs connecting scholarship recipients with professionals in their chosen fields. Childcare cooperatives that help parents manage the logistics of education and career development. Maybe even partnerships with employers who are specifically interested in hiring people who've overcome significant challenges to achieve their goals. As Marcus outlined his ideas, he found himself energized by possibilities that combined his business experience with the community insights he'd gained through his involvement with Little Miracles. The gala had been successful as a single event, but it had also revealed potential for systemic changes that could address the root causes of the challenges facing families like Sarah's. "You're talking about changing the whole approach to supporting low-income families," Sarah said, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and skepticism. That's incredibly ambitious. Do you really think it's possible?" "I think tonight proved that people are ready for something more meaningful than traditional charity," Marcus replied. "The donors who were here weren't just writing checks. They were genuinely interested in building relationships, in being part of solutions rather than just funding them." The conversation continued for more than an hour, with both of them exploring ideas that felt both visionary and practical. Marcus found himself sharing business strategies that could be adapted for community development, while Sarah provided insights into the daily realities facing families that would need to be addressed for any program to succeed. As they talked, Marcus became increasingly aware that their collaboration had evolved into something much more personal than professional partnership. The easy conversation, the shared vision for community impact, the comfortable intimacy of sitting in Sarah's small apartment while Jamie slept nearby, all of it felt like the foundation for something that extended beyond their work with Little Miracles. "I should probably let you get some sleep," Marcus said eventually, noticing that it was nearly midnight and that Sarah had to work at the daycare the following morning. "You've had an incredibly long day, and I imagine Jamie will be up early regardless of how late you stay up tonight." "Probably," Sarah agreed, but Marcus noticed that she made no move to indicate the evening was over. "But I'm glad we had this chance to talk. Sometimes I feel like I'm so focused on just getting through each day that I don't take time to think about bigger possibilities." Her comment revealed something about the mental and emotional constraints that came with the constant pressure of managing survival needs while pursuing long-term goals. Marcus realized that his involvement with Little Miracles had given him insights into forms of stress and challenge that his privileged background had never required him to consider. "What you're doing is remarkable," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine admiration. "Building a career while raising a child alone, especially under the circumstances you've faced, requires a kind of strength that most people never have to develop." Sarah looked at him with an expression that suggested she was moved by his recognition of her struggles, but also perhaps surprised by the depth of understanding he'd developed about her situation. The wealthy businessman who had first approached her at the daycare had evolved into someone who seemed to genuinely comprehend the complexity of her daily reality. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing," Sarah admitted, her voice becoming softer and more vulnerable. "Pursuing nursing school when it means so much time away from Jamie, accepting scholarship help when other people might need it more, even speaking tonight when I felt so out of place among all those successful people." Her confession revealed the self-doubt that accompanied her determined pursuit of her goals, the constant questioning of whether her dreams were worth the sacrifices they required. Marcus recognized the painful irony that someone as clearly deserving of support as Sarah would struggle with feelings of unworthiness, while he had spent years taking his advantages for granted. "You absolutely are doing the right thing," Marcus said with conviction, "Jamie is lucky to have a mother who's willing to work this hard to build a better future for both of you. And the people you'll help as a nurse, the lives you'll save and improve, they need you to complete this program and follow through on your goals." The conversation had moved into territory that felt deeply personal, touching on fears and dreams that went to the heart of who Sarah was as a person. Marcus found himself wanting to continue talking, to understand more about her motivations and concerns, to be part of whatever support system helped her move forward. But practical considerations eventually forced an end to the evening, with both of them acknowledging the late hour and Sarah's early morning responsibilities. As Marcus prepared to leave, he found himself reluctant to return to the impersonal luxury of his own apartment, preferring the warmth and authenticity of Sarah's modest home. "Thank you for tonight," Sarah said as she walked him to the door. "Not just for the gala, but for this conversation, for helping me think about possibilities I hadn't considered before." "Thank you for letting me be part of your journey," Marcus replied, the words carrying more meaning than either of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Standing in the doorway of her apartment, with the sounds of the sleeping city around them and Jamie's soft breathing audible from the living room, Marcus felt a shift in his understanding of what he wanted from life. The corporate success that had once been his primary focus felt less important than the connections he was building with people whose values and priorities were teaching him about forms of wealth that couldn't be measured in financial terms. The drive back to his penthouse gave Marcus time to process the evening and its implications for his future. The gala had been professionally successful beyond his highest expectations, raising enough money to create a scholarship program that could genuinely transform lives. But more importantly, it had demonstrated the satisfaction that came from using his skills and resources for purposes that mattered to people he cared about. As he rode the elevator to his apartment, Marcus carried with him not just the memory of a successful event, but the growing awareness that his involvement with Little Miracles and his relationship with Sarah had changed him in ways that made his previous life feel incomplete. The question now was whether he had the courage to pursue the possibilities that change had revealed, even if it meant stepping away from the safety of his familiar corporate world into something more meaningful, but infinitely more uncertain. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.